Welcome back, guys. I think I'm gonna get started today by pulling the motor out of the 308 because I'm not really sure what else to do. I know there's 1,001 things that I could be doing, but I'm also kind of stuck in this headspace of I'm not sure what to tackle first. All of the jobs in front of me are relatively small, except for the ones that I don't have parts and pieces for. And I kind of like to work my way through jobs in a way that makes sense in my head. I'm limited on those right now until I have some more parts show up. So I'm gonna pull the motor out of the car and get started on some fuel cell mounting, maybe do a little bit of welding while we're in there, start knocking some stuff out. We've got a lot of work to do. So let's get this thing pulled out. As you guys have seen, we've pulled the engine in and out of this car several times at this point, but not since we put the turbo and manifold on it. One slight drawback to the design of this car and how we've set the engine is they need to come off in order to get the engine out. So I've removed them, as well as the bracing, and I went on and removed the intake manifold for good measure to make sure I wouldn't scratch it up. Now, as you guys know by the title, this didn't go as smoothly as I hoped that it would. As I lifted the engine, one side of it got hooked on the engine mount, which really shouldn't be too big of a deal. Anybody who's lifted an engine in and out of a car has had this or something similar happen before. Unfortunately, the strap was not up to the task. So I thought about hiding this through editing, but if you were watching closely, something happened there, and I figure I should share things like this when this happened. It's a moment of learning, even when it's embarrassing. My strap let go picking the engine up. I'm lucky that I didn't get hurt. There's no one else here to get hurt, and the only problem that happened is it bent one of my engine mount tabs, but honestly, not a big deal. I can fix it really easily. But it's definitely a wake-up moment because this is not a light-duty strap. It's not one of those ones that you get in like a pack of 4 for 15 bucks that you would use to kind of hold some stuff down to your roof rack. I mean, I used this because it is a small but very heavy-duty strap. And it wasn't the webbing that broke, it was the stitching around the hook. And it came undone. Startling. I've learned a lesson. I'm only using the big straps to lift an engine from now on. I guess we kind of learn these things the hard way, but I'm showing it because hopefully one of you guys will learn not to use one of these and it can save somebody from getting hurt. So, first time that's ever happened to me. Lesson learned. I was really thankful that the engine didn't drop while it was over the back of the car, causing body damage. That was the greatest blessing of all. I'd rather have it land on my hand than have that happen. Now, when the engine fell, it was only a few inches, but it landed at an odd angle, which made it a challenge to hook up once again and get out of the car. Even still, with the mishaps, the entire removal only took about 20 minutes. Now, for this next segment, you'll have to forgive the footage. I know that it's a little bit hectic. I somehow left my GoPro recording on time-lapse instead of real time, so this whole segment is a bit sped up. But I climbed into the engine bay and spent a couple of hours cutting and grinding down all of the little tabs, the hangers, the bits and pieces that just add to making the chassis in this car absolutely hideous. There's no way we're ever going to make it look great, but we can at least clean it up and make it look a little bit better. While I was in there, I decided it was finally time to go on and get rid of the fuel tank straps that held the factory fuel tanks in place. We're not going to need them anymore, and it should be only a matter of weeks before we have the new fuel cell in hand. These straps were held in by pins with a cotter pin through each side, and I can't imagine how difficult it would be to get these out if you actually had an engine in the car, especially the factory V8. To get the cotter pins out, I used needle nose pliers and kind of the curling over method, which is admittedly terrible for the pliers themselves, but these have a lifetime warranty, so I'm not too worried about it. If you guys have a better suggestion of how to get cotter pins out, though, I'm all ears. Next on the list was removing the remaining coolant pipe that runs to the front of the car. We're not going to use this anymore because we're going to replace it with AN line, and removal in the future would be impossible. Here's a look at our cleanup work so far, and admittedly, the chassis is still hideous. There's nothing we can do about that. But we are making slow and steady improvements, and I think it'll all look better once it's all texture painted black and we have all of our pieces in place. I'm pretty happy with what we removed from the car. It's a decent bit of weight to add up. But what I'm not happy with is the rust that has settled on everything, especially over the last week. It's been pretty humid in the shop. All of the horizontal surfaces that are bare metal are starting to get a bit of surface rust, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to clean it all up while everything is accessible and clear. And I'm hoping this week we'll get in and start welding all of this stuff up, and it's going to need to be clean for that. With most of our cleanup work out of the way, we can actually move on to the actual goal for today's video, which is building a support for the fuel cell. The fuel cell is going to go between the frame rails, or rather on top of them. It's going to span the gap, and we need something underneath it to help support the weight, because once there's a lot of fuel in it, it needs to be strong and supported. I went through all of the material that I have in the shop, and could only conjure up 20 gauge sheet metal or 1/8 inch plate. And so I went with the 1/8 inch plate thinking I might as well go overboard. It might be heavy, but it will definitely reinforce the chassis and reduce chassis flex. Seems like a win overall. I laid out the part with a 4-inch width, a 1-inch flange on each side, and 23 inches in overall width so that it will span to the halfway point on each frame rail. I laid out a series of dimple dies to add some strength and lightness, and went to building it. But, as you guys can probably tell with a close look, the 1/8 inch material was just a bit too much to handle for my tools. This whole thing started to warp, the vertical edges were starting to distort and wiggle, and the entire part started to bow as I was putting the dimple dies in place. That in and of itself isn't a problem, it normally happens with parts like this, but the 1/8 inch material did not want to bend back to shape as I continued. It was also too much to ask for my dimple die. Even though I only used the bolt as a guide pin, it wanted to kink as it went through the material and bent the bolt. So overall, this just did not work. I went back to the drawing board, borrowed some 17 gauge material from my neighbor Brett, and rebuilt the part with a lot more ease. In retrospect, this is how I should have handled it from the get-go. 1/8 inch material was just going to be too heavy and bulky for what I needed. It goes back to finding the right tool for the job. The last part of this job was actually fitting our brace to the chassis, so I climbed back in the engine bay and used the Milwaukee battery-powered angle grinder to cope the edges of this thing. It took a pretty serious cope to drop it into place, but after a few minutes I had it fitted and it looked better than ever. It's hard to admire a part like this in such a nasty looking engine bay, but seeing the part on the workbench, I am happy with the way that it turned out, and I do think the engine bay will really start to take shape once we get the rest of the details worked out. In order to mount the fuel cell once we get it, there are 2 big brackets sticking out of the rear bulkhead that we need to remove. You can see them at the corners. In order to remove them, I decided to remove the insulating shield that is up against the firewall. With all the work that we've done so far throughout this series, there were only 4 rivets left holding this thing in, so removal was quite easy. Now for anybody immediately worried at the sight of white insulation, no, this is not asbestos, nor is it fiberglass. This material is called rock wool, and it's found all over the place in the back of this Ferrari. This stuff is glued to the back of this insulation panel for heat protection, and honestly, I don't really plan on putting this thing back in. If you take a look at the outside of it, it's pretty old and beat up, and because we don't have an exhaust to contend with on this side of the engine anymore, I really don't think it will be necessary. A lot of the rock wool is still held on by some glue to the rear bulkhead, so I'm using the die grinder and a bristle disc to get this stuff removed. Now, I know I've talked about this tool and plenty of other tools a lot, and I'm happy to announce that I do finally have Amazon affiliate links to the tools I'm using in the description of the video. So if you want to snag any of the stuff that I'm using when I talk about it in a video, you can now find a link for it in the description with a link that'll help me out if you buy anything. And as always, these tools are not sponsored, and if they are, I'll be sure to let you guys know. With the rock wool removed, it was time to cut off those 2 brackets. And once you see the cleaned up rear bulkhead, I'm happy to say this thing is looking a lot better. Yeah, I'll get it out of the way. I know in the last clip you already saw, I cut this off. Don't worry, it'll grow back quickly. It was time, it was annoying. Time to move on. On the note of what we've accomplished so far in this episode, I know that if all I'm gonna get done in a single episode spanning several days is a cross brace across some chassis rails and some cleanup, that I'm not gonna get this car done in time. We're all on the same page there. This will not cut it. We've gotta make more progress than that. However, even though that's all I'm gonna get physically done in this episode, I got a lot done this weekend in the form of intangibles, and I'm really excited about it because I've crossed kind of a hurdle that's been the biggest one. It's been stressing me out like crazy. It's this whole suspension upright thing. What am I gonna do? What am I gonna use? What am I gonna do for brakes and hubs? How am I gonna solve all of these problems? Because I need all of that figured out before I can build custom control arms, and I need to get all the suspension geometry correct. I mean, there's so many variables and unknowns, and I have finally come up with a solution that I think is gonna be a really good one. We're gonna have parts maybe by Thursday's episode, but if not, for Tuesday's episode, we're gonna get to talk about all of it, discuss the plan of attack, how we're gonna modify some parts and pieces, and start building some control arms. I'm really excited for this. However, because we don't have parts on hand right now, all we're gonna be able to do is kind of talk by the car about some of my decision making and what we're gonna do. If you don't wanna talk tech, feel free to check the timeline at the bottom and go on and skip ahead. We're gonna be giving away those skateboard decks at the end of the episode. No problems. But if you're interested in my thought process and how I've come to a conclusion, we're gonna dive into it. All right, guys, forgive the informality of this, but we're just gonna kind of talk over a few things. I know we've discussed a lot of this already, but I wanna give you a quick rundown so that we kind of have a better idea of what I'm going after. The major overall goal is to take this wheel hub and move it further out towards the outside of the car. The main reason for that is so that we have an improved scrub radius. If we were to bolt a wheel onto this right now, it would drive terribly. And we also want to change the bolt pattern of the hub here. This is 5x108, which is what Ferraris have been for a long time. And I'd like to convert the car to 5x114.3. Now, theoretically, we could just move the spindle outwards by lengthening the control arms, but there's not a hub option that would allow us to convert to 5x114.3. If you guys look really closely, you'll notice that the hub pattern at 5x108 fits right to the outside edge of the hub. There's not enough meat here to extend the bolt pattern out. So this whole thing is pretty much trash. It's just not gonna work for us. So we might as well redo all of this. We should redefine the entire upright and work with something a bit more off the shelf, a bit more available, and a bit more customizable than this kind of cast steel part here. So what I've decided to do is actually replace this with Corvette parts. I've mentioned Corvettes before. Their geometry is really well established and the parts are very easily available. The one thing that is important though is I need to be very conscious about the distance between the lower ball joint and the upper ball joint. As this moves outwards, those will close together ever so slightly, and I need something that I can adjust in order to get the suspension geometry absolutely correct. And if we just kind of wing it, we're gonna wind up with a suspension setup that does not work after we put custom control arms on this that are something like 3 inches longer. So what I've found is a steel sheet metal fabricated upright for a Corvette. It uses Corvette hubs and will allow us to have Corvette geometry, but because this whole setup will be steel, we can cut and modify it as we see fit and make the changes we need to make this whole thing work. Now, one trade-off is that we will be kind of sacrificing some weight in comparison to some really cool billet uprights that I have found, such as parts for a Lotus or even Corvettes. There are a lot of other options out there, but those are all thousands and thousands of dollars, long lead times, and I would buy them and still have to figure out how to make them work. And we can't really be cutting and welding aluminum uprights for this job. That's not really safe. One other benefit that we do have by using a Corvette upright though is that the brake mounts will allow us to run a C6 Corvette brake kit right off the shelf, along with off-the-shelf hubs. Now, some of you may know that Corvettes are 5x120.65, which is not 5x114, but I have found hubs that have flat surfaces, just like this, front and rear, so that we can add the 5x114 bolt pattern onto the hub between the existing bolts. So we can actually have a dual drilled hub, a dual drilled rotor hat, and we can run 5x114 or 5x120.65 wheels on the car. It'll give us some more options if we do decide to change things down the road. Overall, it's not the craziest kind of execution, the craziest idea, but we'll be able to do things like placing the steering arm wherever we need it on the upright because everything is made of steel. And it just gives us a lot of customizability. And ultimately, if we like the way that it all works, we can then take the steel upright that we have modified and made work for us and have it built out of billet aluminum later down the road once we have more time and we're not trying to meet a deadline. Once again, we really could just lengthen the upper and lower control arms and move this whole assembly outwards. But the main problem is that this hub has a design flaw, and even on factory engine 308s, this whole piece will break off and your wheel and tire will go ejecto-cedo cuz, and that's not gonna work for us. We don't want that. We need something much stronger here, and that's another reason why we should go with some Corvette parts. We're actually gonna use front Corvette uprights in the rear as well. We will use a track rod to keep the toe in place, and we will use a rear Corvette hub mounted to it because they are interchangeable, and we can set this up exactly how we want, where we want. We will push the whole upright assembly outwards, closer to the outside of the car, and it should be a relatively simple setup to build. And then we'll just have to add our upper control arm mount back in here and build our upper control arms, rebuild our lower control arms. We'll use Heim joints where we can. Should be a pretty simple setup. I'm excited. It's something that we should be able to knock out in a couple of weeks. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it than just kind of those tidbits. I have been kind of slaving over this for weeks, trying to figure out exactly what to do. We're gonna dive into all of that in the next episode once I get those parts, hopefully Wednesday, but maybe Tuesday next week. We're gonna really dive into suspension and design. We're gonna start drawing stuff up in CAD. We're gonna be taking a look at our parts. We're gonna figure out where we want everything to be positioned. And we'll dive more into some of the options that I looked at, the reasons I didn't go with them. But like I said, I wanna save some of this for the episode where it makes a lot more sense to discuss it. But uprights are on the way. They are in stock. I don't have to wait for custom machined parts. I'm really into this. We can modify them here easily. We don't have to worry about, trying to figure out welding aluminum uprights and stuff. That really wouldn't work for longevity. They're gonna be likely to bend or break. I think we've got a good solution here. I'm excited about it. It's a couple of sacrifices in terms of weight, but in the end, we can use this to get us to a fully billet upright later down the line. And we don't need absolutely insanely competitive parts right out of the gate. We can work our way to get there. Okay, let's give away some skate decks. In the last 308 episode, I told you guys I was going to give away 5 of these limited edition 308 skate decks that my friends at H&R made. And the way to enter was pretty easy. All you had to do is to leave a comment on the last video or to be a Patreon subscriber. Now, to choose those winners, I used a couple of different random generators to try to keep this nice and fair. For the 2 random commenters, our first winner is Race Bays with a comment of, "I need one of those decks." Now, our second winner is Victor Norberg with an awesomely thoughtful comment, and I'm really excited a skate deck is going to him as well. Now for the Patreon supporters, I used a randomized wheel of all of the names. There weren't many of you guys, so the odds of winning one were pretty good. Samuel Hartley has won the first deck, Overcrest has won the second, and the third goes to James Cook. All right, there you guys have it. Those are our winners. The names are right here next to me. If you are on Patreon, I will reach out to you. I have your contact info already. The 2 comment winners, reach out to me on Instagram, Mike_StanceWorks. Send me a DM. I will probably ask you to verify your identity so I can make sure somebody's not trying to steal your deck. But the 5 of you guys will be getting one of these boards, these limited edition 308 skate decks. I'm enthusiastic that so many of you guys entered and participated in this. There were like 1,300 comments on that last episode, and that's exciting. I'm just stoked that so many of you guys wanted to take one of these home. Maybe we'll do a giveaway. I have a few more left. Maybe we'll do something else as we get further down the line, as SEMA gets closer, things like that. I'm hoping that by this time next week, I'm gonna have some DTM posters up for sale. Patreon guys, you guys will have access to that first. In all, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This one's a wrap. We had a little bit of fabrication, a little bit of cutting stuff up, a lot of suspension stuff figured out, even though I know it wasn't really exciting to see, but parts are officially on the way. I mean, we have actual progress happening. The floodgates are about to open. It could be within a week's time that we are building control arms, setting up the suspension, figuring out tie rod ends, getting all of our stuff positioned correctly, getting wheels on the car, getting brakes on order, all that kind of stuff. We finally have a solution. It's been a big hurdle and it is out of the way. I am pumped. Thank you guys as always for watching. I will catch you guys on Thursday in the next episode. We're gonna keep at it.